Hello, Paul Markham here, and this is my 1952 Tatra T600 Tatra plan. In March of 2021, the American insurance group and online media publisher Haggerty's published a story about the Tatra T97 by a group of investigative journalists, where they flipped a Tatra over to demonstrate how unsafe it was, proving the old canard that the Tatra was the Czech secret weapon and killed a lot of Nazis. Tatra owners the world over rolled their eyes in, just frustration and exasperation at such idiocy. All those stories are actually total and utter BS. So I'm going to go for a little bit of a drive in the Tatra, and I'm going to give you a rundown of the top Tatra myths and debunk them. If you know nothing at all about Tatras, there's probably one thing you do know, and that is it's a Nazi killer. If you go looking for Tatra anywhere on the internet, you'll find stories that Adolf Hitler banned his officers from driving Tatras because they were so dangerous and so many officers were killed. The reputation of the Tatra as a Nazi killer gained for the company the moniker the Czech secret weapon. That's certainly the most popular myth out there on the internet. I'm sorry to say that not a single word of that is true. Nobody ever called the Tatra the Czech secret weapon. There's not even any record anywhere of any officers ever having an accident in a Tatra. And there is certainly not a single piece of evidence that Hitler ever said anything negative about Tatra or banned people from driving them. It's an entirely fabricated story that pops up in the 1980s. Adolf Hitler, when he saw the Tatra T97 at the Berlin Auto Show, was stunned by it. He absolutely was fascinated by the car because it was so cutting edge and so space age that he had a long conversation with its designer, Hans Lidwinka, who is always described as being Czech, but should probably really be called an Austro-Hungarian. He was born in Bohemia, or actually he was born just outside of Vienna into a German-speaking family, and he never ever in his entire life ever spoke Czech. He only spoke German. He considered himself a German, and he lived, Tatra factory was actually in the Sudetenland, which is where the ethnic Germans were when the borders got changed, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire got dissolved. He was very similar in that way to Ferdinand Porsche, who was also a Bohemian, Austro-Hungarian citizenship. Both of them actually had Czech passports in the 1920s because it was much better for them to be a Czech national than an Austrian national, because the Austrians and the Germans, there were restrictions on travel and trade, whereas Czech nationality didn't have any of those hindrances. But again, neither Porsche nor Lidwinka, or Adolf Hitler for that matter, who was also an Austro-Hungarian, ever spoke Czech. They all considered themselves ethnically German. When Hitler saw the Tatra T97, he was amazed, and Lidwinka had a long conversation with him about the technical aspects of the car, which Hitler was very fascinated with technical aspects of modern technologies. And Hitler would go on to tell Robert Ley, who was the infrastructure minister, who was in charge of the building of the autobahns, that the Tatra is the car for the German autobahn. He didn't mean it specifically the Tatra was that car, but a car like the Tatra. Modern, steel, cutting-edge design. Rear engines, again, because rear engines were seen as being the cutting edge of modern vehicle design. Did Tatras crash? Yes, they did. People crashed cars all the time. Tatra was no less or better safe than any other vehicle of the period, the 1930s. The manual for the T97 and T87 had very clear and explicit instructions right at the beginning of the driver's manual. And it said, this is a very fast car. And it is easy to forget you're driving a very powerful vehicle because the engine's in the back and it's very quiet. It's all streamlined, so you move through the air very quietly without much wind noise. And it's easy to forget how fast you're going. And that was a very specific warning to people because, again, 1930s technologies, brakes, weight distribution of the car made the cars somewhat difficult to handle if you're traveling at speed. But anybody driving a Tatra, especially at speed, would know this. There's another reason why we can tell that this is an entirely fraudulent story, is because A, no one ever mentions who these people were. It's always Adolf Hitler, lots of Nazi officers. Now, the kind of officers that would end up driving a Tatra were very, very prestigious officers. One well-known owner was Erwin Rommel. He'd been driving a Tatra T87 as his personal car for many years before. It's not the sort of car that anyone can just get a hold of. During the war, the Germans restricted who could actually own cars, and people had their cars confiscated for use by the military. People couldn't just go in and buy them. The other thing is, in using cars like the T87 as a staff car, would have a driver, not the officer. The officers would never be driving their car. They would have a driver, professional driver, drive for them. And the professional drivers were exactly that. Most of those people who were in that kind of role were actually previously chauffeurs, and sports car drivers, and people with really good driving experience. So there is no names. It's all just made up. Why did the story originate in the first place? Well, I'm pretty certain that it was because no one in the West really knew much about Tatras. They were an obscure car that sort of appeared briefly in the 1930s. They made a big name for themselves and then they just disappeared because they were on the other side of the Iron Curtain. This means that when people started seeing Tatras become available in the market, in the 1980s they started to be sold off here and there. People, lazy journalists, so especially put this down to a lot of lazy journalism, people started making up stories to make the marque seem more interesting. And then once that story started about, oh, they were dangerous cars, lots of Germans got killed in it, there's no, as I said, there's no evidence for that. But once that story starts, especially nowadays with internet journalism, which is atrociously lazy in most instances, people just made this shit up. Some really, really good examples, and I've got a post on my blog which goes through some of these examples and talks about the actual evidence. Why did Tatra get a bad reputation for bad handling? Ironically, and it's quite interesting, I think, is because of the British. In 1946, a Tatra staff car had been used by the Germans and then had been commandeered by Europeans, the Western Allies, shipped a car to the Volkswagen plant for evaluation. After the war, the Allies were very keen to understand the best technology that the Germans had, because they had a reputation, of course, for being very good engineers. The British motoring industry, however, was not interested at all in finding out how good German vehicles were. And the Tatra was regarded at that time as a German vehicle. As I said, it was part of the Greater Germany, it was in the Sudetenland, it was developed by Germans. The car that they received was a Tatra T97. It was running on about 5 or 6 cylinders. It's very unclear from the report, but it certainly was not up to its best. It had 4 different wheel hubs with 4 different tyres. They were all out of balance. The suspension on the vehicle was completely and utterly shot. So the car was in appallingly bad condition. But they tested it nonetheless. And of course, that test resulted in the inevitable, this car handles terribly. It's a terrible car, there's nothing to learn from it. The replacement engine is problematic, and the car is unstable at speed. Reminds one a little bit of the whole business with the Corvair and the unsafe at any speed farce. At any rate, that's the only that report that was issued in 1946 is the only handling report that was available to people in the 1980s in English. So people have used that report, extrapolated it out into bad handling, and then have made up the story about Germans being killed. The other really big myth is that Ferdinand Porsche took the ideas for a rear engine car from Hans Ledwinka, and Hans Ledwinka is the real designer of the Tatra, the Volkswagen, sorry. And as evidence for that, they always proclaim Tatra sued Volkswagen after the war and received 3 million Deutschmarks. That story itself is a complete misrepresentation of an actual real story. Well, firstly, let's go back to Ferdinand Porsche and his experience as a designer. He certainly didn't need to borrow the ideas of a rear engine car and air cooling from Hans Ledwinka. Both he and Porsche, and quite a few others actually, this wasn't a unique thing. A rear engine car with air cooling is like scarcely unique at all. Had been looking at this technical challenge for a long period in the 1930s. The difference was that Tatra were the first in. They got their car into production in 1934, and all of their research into how best to air cool an engine inside a big steel car, they patented. Now, the patents were not patented by Tatra, the company, or by Hans Ledwinka. They were patented in the name of the Ringhofer family. Now, the Ringhofer family were Austro-Hungarian industrial conglomerate family business that made trains, diesel engines, rolling stock. Tatra also made rolling stock. So the two businesses were very aligned. And in the 1930s, the Ringhofers purchased Tatra. So Tatra became a subsidiary of the company. The company you find in their advertising was always described during the war period as the Ringhofer Tatra. Anyway, it was the Ringhofers who had their names on the patents. That was just the way it was done. Hans Ledwinka, after the war, was arrested by the Czech authorities, not the communist authorities, so I'm clear about that. It wasn't the communists who put him in prison, but it was the nationalists. You've got to remember, of course, Ledwinka considered himself a German. So he was a foreign speaker in Czechoslovakia, and during the war, Tatra had built tanks, armoured cars, half-tracks, trains, rolling stocks, as well as vehicles, and loads and loads of military trucks. That was their main product. So Ledwinka, although he was a Czech national but a German, he was not somebody that the Czech authorities wanted to have in the country, so they arrested him. And he was sent to prison for 6 years as a collaborator, and at the end of his term, he left the country. This was before the communists came into power later on. He was in prison in 1946. Ledwinka then retired to live in Munich, where he worked as a consulting engineer for a number of other companies. He never sued Volkswagen, and he had made comments in the media articles that both he and Ferdinand Porsche had looked over each other's shoulders as they developed things during the 1930s, because they were both working in the same field. It was absolutely natural that the developments in one company would be heard about by another, and they would look at it and see what they could borrow. There's nothing unusual in that at all. Anyway, another of the Ringhofer family, they too were German speakers. They lost all of their holdings in their industrial group after the war. It was confiscated, nationalised by the new Czech government, and they also moved to Germany. So they found themselves in a difficult position of being, formerly big industrialists and now virtually penniless. The Ringhofers were also an extremely litigious group, especially when it came to patent infringement. So they sued Volkswagen. They hoped that they could use the patents that they had put forward in the 1930s about air cooling would give them some sort of primacy claim over the Volkswagen, because that was seen to be a huge opportunity for them to get some money coming back in, and they could revive their fortunes. The court case dragged on and on for quite a while. Volkswagen was very keen to fight everything to do with the pre-war period. They really, really wanted to divorce the company from its, Nazi heritage. Unfortunately, they got to the point that it's the air cooling, because Tatra and the Ringhofers had patented every possible combination of forced air cooling on a rear engine. So there's just no way around it. So when it looked like Volkswagen were going to lose the case, they decided to settle with the Ringhofers. The payout was 1 million Deutschmarks. It's not 3 million. Tatra, as a company in Czechoslovakia, had nothing to do with it. They never ever raised a case against Volkswagen. And nor did Hans Ledwinka. Hans Ledwinka continued to live in Munich, where he remained on fairly good terms with Porsche's son, Ferry. After that particular case had been won by the Ringhoffers, the Porsches, as a family, they kind of felt that that was unfair on Ledwinka, because Ledwinka's research and Ledwinka's engineering was what the Ringhoffers had profited from. So they attempted to sue as well on behalf of Ledwinka. That case never got off the ground. It was Ledwinka died before the case could even be pulled together. So these comments, the comments about Ferdinand Porsche looking over the shoulder of Ledwinka, those quotes actually came from Ferry, who was Ferdinand Porsche's son. Not Porsche himself and not Ledwinka. And it was based upon a paraphrasing of some conversations that had been had within the family. The other big myth is that the T97, Hitler put a stop to that and cancelled production of the T97 because it looked too much like the Volkswagen. This car that I'm driving now is the Tatra T600, which is actually a post-war version of the T97. Flat 4, boxer engine in the back, just under 2 litres. In the Tatra it's actually just like 1900 and something or other cubic inches. In the T97 it was 1697 or something like that, so it's a little bit bigger engine. And actually, between the two cars, the Volkswagen and the T97, the only similar thing about them is that they have a rear engine and it's a flat 4. T97 was a luxury car. It was just at a slightly less luxurious level and price tag to the big V8. It was never intended to be a major vehicle for mass production. When Tatra designed the vehicle, they had only put in an order at the factory for 101 cars. And that was all they ever had planned to build. And then would see whether or not it was worthwhile continuing on. Because, again, Tatra was a really low... It was a low volume producer. Its major business was trucks. That was where the mass production went. Right, the T87 and the T97, both of those cars were produced at a very, very slow rate and almost at order. Especially during the wartime, when all private car or civilian car production was pretty much banned by the Germans. Tatra was one of the few companies that didn't get a ban order placed on it for the manufacture of vehicles, and that was only because, despite everything that they say about it being banished, banned from being used, the only people that were ordering Tatras was the German army, and they were never banned from building them. They continued building T87s right up to 1945. So that's another, to see through this absolute BS that people talk about, the Nazi killer story. Anyway, that's they're the big myths. Go into a lot more detail. There's certainly more evidence against the myths than for them. But the internet these days is a cesspool of lies, fake news, just everything. It's almost embarrassing when you read some of these stories. like the Haggerty story. There's been several other in British media about the Tatra, and you kind of think, you journalists who write this stuff are absolute idiots. But then I guess they don't really care. Everybody's just looking for the likes and the, you know, impressions on Facebook, YouTube. It says a lot of bad things for the future of information and truth in our age. Anyway, that's I hope that was interesting.